afternoon, everybody. My name is Nala Ayed. I'm the host of CBC Radio's Ideas and MC for this very special event, the 67th annual Beatty Lecture with Dr. Anthony Fauci. For 7 decades, the Beatty Lectures have been delivered on McGill campus, on the McGill downtown campus. Now, for the second year in a row, the Beatty has gone virtual to bring important ideas to audiences while protecting their health and safety in the ongoing pandemic. People are watching this broadcast from all over, from near and far, from around the world, in fact, including the Quebec Health Minister. Indeed, it is an honor to have with us today, as part of our virtual audience, Monsieur Christian Dubé, Ministre de la Santé et des Services Sociaux du Québec. Bienvenue, Ministre. Today is particularly special. Immediately following the Beatty Lecture, McGill will bestow upon Dr. Fauci an honorary doctorate of science in a special virtual ceremony. And to watch that, you simply just stay on this viewing page once the Beatty Lecture is completed. A note to our audience, of course, these are pandemic times, as with many of us working virtually. So please do be patient if we run into any technical difficulties. Now, I would like to first welcome McGill's 17th Principal and Vice Chancellor, Suzanne Fortier, to say a few remarks.
Merci Nala. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. Je suis ravie d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. To all the McGill alumni joining us as part of the bicentennial at-home homecoming, bienvenue chez vous. Today, it is McGill's distinct honor to welcome one of the world's most prominent infectious disease experts, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who will deliver the 67th annual Beatty Lecture. More than ever before, the world relies on the expertise and courage of scientists, researchers, and innovators to help us navigate the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm grateful to every member of our campus community, including McGill's researchers, students, and healthcare professionals, for their resilience and for their contributions to the search for solutions. As we celebrate our bicentennial year, we also recognize how McGill has, over 2 centuries, brought together some of the world's most talented people to collaborate and share ideas. The Beatty Lecture is an important part of the McGill story. As one of Canada's longest-running endowed lectureships, the Beatty is a testament to our university's enduring commitment to excellence and to the exchange of ideas. I invite you to stay tuned at the conclusion of the event for a short video about the Beatty Lecture's fascinating history and the recently published anthology of past lectures. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Martha Crago, Vice Principal Research and Innovation, to formally introduce our 2021 Beatty Lecturer. Je vous souhaite à tous une excellente conférence et une très belle journée.
Thank you, Principal Fortier. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. It's my pleasure to welcome our virtual audience from near and far to this very special Beatty Lecture. As McGill's Vice Principal of Research and Innovation, I'm often tasked with answering the question, why does basic research matter? Well, to offer one answer, I'll quote our esteemed speaker, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who said, "The challenge and the beauty of basic research is that you don't know what you don't know." Driven to shed light on the unknown, scientists from around the world have achieved amazing breakthroughs since the outbreak of COVID-19, such as applying mRNA technology for the first time to the development of vaccines. Those breakthroughs owe an unsung debt to the building blocks of basic research conducted by Dr. Fauci and others well before the outbreak of this pandemic, including their seminal work on the human immune response in rheumatology, AIDS, and Ebola. To answer the question another way, science builds on science. As the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the longtime chief of the Laboratory of Immunoregulation and the chief medical advisor to the President of the United States. Dr. Fauci has been a global advocate for scientific innovation in the fights against COVID-19 and other infectious and immune diseases for over 40 years. For example, he was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that provides life-saving antiretroviral treatment and counseling worldwide. Under his leadership, the NIAID has accelerated research to combat the Zika and Ebola viruses, and he continues to devote much of his research to the immunopathogenic mechanisms of HIV infection and the scope of the body's immune responses to HIV. Undoubtedly, his work has saved countless lives. He is the recipient of numerous honors, including the Dan David Prize, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Canada Gairdner Global Health Award. It is a true honor for me to welcome him virtually to McGill and to invite him now to deliver the 2021 Beatty Lecture entitled COVID-19 Lessons Learned and Remaining Challenges.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crago, for that very kind introduction. It really is truly an honor and a great pleasure for me to be delivering the Beatty Lecture here at McGill. I'm going to be talking, as you see on this first slide, about COVID-19, which is, as we all well know, has gripped the entire planet for the last 20 months. I'm going to talk about lessons learned and remaining challenges. In preparation for the lecture, I could not help but remember the first time I testified before the United States Congress during the very early years of HIV, and that was about 38 years ago. And what I did is that I made a map of the world, and I was talking about the entire concept of emerging and re-emerging infections. And the first time I testified, and this was to defend the NIH budget, I put HIV on the map, and we spoke about HIV in the context of emerging infections. So in the literally hundreds of times that I've testified before Congress over the last 37 years, I very frequently show this slide, and I show it over and over again. They never seem to get bored because each year I add one, sometimes two, sometimes three emerging infections. And the last time I did this, several months ago, this is what it looked like. Now, not every single emerging infection on this slide is one of any consequence. Some are merely curiosities, but every once in a while, you do get a truly transforming outbreak of a pandemic. And in fact, when people would ask me what my worst nightmare is, I would say that this was something that was a respiratory-borne virus that jumped species from an animal host, a new virus that we've never experienced before, and one that is highly transmissible with a great deal of efficiency and has the capability of causing a great deal of morbidity and mortality. I refer to it as my worst nightmare, my bad dream, the thing that keeps me up at night. In fact, about 6.5 years ago, when I was doing a C-SPAN interview, this person asked me that question, which gets asked to me literally hundreds of times. And my answer, this is a quote from that C-SPAN interview: my number one concern way out there is the idea of an emerging and re-emerging infections that we haven't been exposed to before that spread by a respiratory route. And so here we are, and that's what we're going to be talking about. This is a viewpoint that I wrote literally a couple of weeks into the pandemic in January of 2020. And I entitled it Coronavirus Infections More Than Just the Common Cold. And I did that because I wanted the readers of the viewpoint to realize, because at that point, the sequence of the novel coronavirus had been put on a public database by the Chinese, and people always refer to coronaviruses as common cold viruses. So why was this coronavirus causing such great concern in the very early weeks of the outbreak? Well, if one looks at the phylogenetic tree of the coronavirus, the human coronaviruses are in red font, but the four that are now highlighted in yellow were the four coronaviruses that each of us, myself and those listening and viewing, get exposed to and get relatively minor upper respiratory infections continually, usually over the winter months, over the years. However, in 2002, we experienced, for the first time to our knowledge, at least within the realm of our own historical perspective, the first pandemic coronavirus with SARS, which I'll get to in a moment. And then 10 years later, again, another real and or potential coronavirus pandemic with the Middle East respiratory syndrome. So let's take a look at SARS-CoV-1. Eerily similar in how it evolved. In November 2002, in the Guangdong province of China, an atypical pneumonia was recognized, which the Chinese at first were saying was just an atypical influenza. And then as we started to get more and more cases, it became a little bit more puzzling until someone went from Guangdong province to Hong Kong and stayed at the Metropole Hotel. And from that hotel, we had the spreading in a rather robust way among more than a dozen people, who then did what most people who go to Hong Kong do. They got on a plane and they went to various places throughout the world. I'm speaking to an audience now very familiar with that, since Canada was certainly one of the countries that was very much involved in the pandemic nature of the original SARS. And what we had over a period of time from November 2002 to July 2003 was truly a pandemic, nothing of the magnitude of what we're seeing now, but truly a pandemic with over 8,000 cases and close to 800 deaths. Due to the particular characteristics of this virus and its ability to spread from person to person in the community and other characteristics, pure public health measures such as isolation, quarantine, contact tracing was able in a non-pharmacologic way to contain the outbreak. Then 10 years later came MERS. I might mention that it took quite a while, as a matter of fact, years, to finally nail down the chain from a bat virus to a civet cat to a human. Then came MERS, again, an isolation of a novel coronavirus in a man from Saudi Arabia who presented with pneumonia. It was much easier to do the trace of the origin of this virus, which was shown very clearly to be in a bat to a camel, and the contact between camels and man in the context of the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia, and was not readily transmissible from person to person. However, it did have an extraordinarily concerning case fatality rate as high as 36%, whereas the original SARS, as I showed you, was approximately 10%. There are continual reemergences of this. So this was not a one-off emergence with spread from human to human. It was continual emergences. So that's the prior experience with coronaviruses. Fast forward to today, again, eerily similar. In the Wuhan district of China, the appearance mostly clustered at first in a highly populated part of the country, the city of Wuhan with 11 million people, which is the hub of traffic of animals in wet markets, to finally the identification of yet again another coronavirus, with the Chinese putting on a public database the sequence of what we now know is SARS-CoV-2. And as you can see on the phylogenetic tree, the close proximity to some bat coronaviruses, including the rat G13, but most recently, as we could get into in some of the questions, viruses now in bats in places like northern Laos, which are even closer to SARS-CoV-2 than the laboratory rat G13. Okay, so where does this take us now? We are all living, as we know, in history, as it were, or history to be made, in that we have the worst outbreak of a pandemic respiratory disease in well over 100 years, dating back to the historic pandemic of influenza of 1918, with, as of this morning, 234 million cases with about 4.8 million deaths globally. The United States is one of a handful of countries that has been hit the most hard with this outbreak, with 43 million cases as of 2 days ago. And now we've reached the extraordinary 700,000 death total. The distribution of cases per 100,000 population is shown here with the color density map of the United States. If you look at this, we have had more US deaths from the wars and major pandemics than we've had of anything, as shown by the comparability here. Now, obviously, it's a bit unfair to compare it to the 1918 flu, because the population of the world and the United States was approximately 1/3 then of what it is today. This is the schematic of the various slopes of this virus, a most disconcerting and unique evolution of an infectious disease. As we all know, we, as did the Canadians and others throughout the world, began to see the early spring 2020 outbreak, which reached the peak, came down, and didn't do what everybody expected to do in the summer, was to essentially do what influenza does. In fact, we had a second surge, which went up, as shown in green. Again, troublingly, did not come back down to another baseline until we had the massive surge in the late fall and winter of 2021, which went into the late winter and early spring. Again, never coming back down to a baseline that would make it seem out of the pandemic phase. It stayed in the pandemic phase. And here we are right now, again, in the United States, with well over 100,000 cases a day, 10,000 hospitalizations, and an average of 2,000 deaths per day. As you can see, it's starting to slope down now, but one doesn't take much comfort in the down slopes, because, as we'll know as we talk about in a moment or so, the importance of vaccine as now something new in that circle that we did not have in the other slopes. But a downward slope means you have to put your foot on the accelerator as opposed to taking it off. It's interesting that the pattern of the slopes, though somewhat less, fortunately for Canada, is less than the United States. But you could see the patterns did mimic each other, as you might expect in countries that share a border and have so much interaction, at least formally, back and forth. We can talk a little bit about that later in the questions, but let's move on to the virology. We know a lot about this virus now. It's a beta coronavirus, as I mentioned, an RNA virus with a large genome, 4 structural proteins, the S or spike protein, is the most important due to its receptor binding domain, which binds to the ACE2 receptor, its cellular receptor found on upper and lower airway, GI tract, cardiovascular tissue, and some endothelial cells. Transmission now well understood, although, as we know, in the early weeks and months, it was not particularly well understood. We know now that the transmission is by inhalation and exposure to the infectious respiratory fluids of small, fine respiratory droplets. Although there was some confusion before, it's clear now that aerosol particles are involved, and deposition of these droplets or aerosols on the mucous membrane of the nose, mouth, or eyes, much less common than was originally thought, is transmission through contact with contaminated surfaces of fomites. And risk, as we all know now, is the greatest in enclosed places with poor ventilation and during behaviors such as exercise with the high risk in a gymnasium, singing with the high risk in choirs in places of worship, and any prolonged indoor exposure. Now to some very interesting and at first very perplexing, and in some cases misleading aspects of the novelty of this virus. That the same virus that can kill 700,000 people in the United States and close to 5 million people worldwide is a virus that is essentially without symptoms in about 1/3 to 40% of the people, namely never develop symptoms. Another aspect of the virus that got into the confusion about the wearing of masks early on is that we did not realize or even imagine that between 50 and 60% of the transmissions would occur from an asymptomatic person, either one of those individuals who would never develop symptoms or from a person in the pre-symptomatic stage of the disease. Now, clinical manifestations. For those who do develop symptoms, the clinical presentation is strikingly similar to what we see with influenza. However, as we all know now, there is a unique symptom and sign, which in fact we rarely see with other infections, and that is the peculiar loss of smell and taste that generally precedes the onset of respiratory symptoms and can linger beyond the clearing up of most systemic signs and symptoms. With regard to the protein spectrum of disease, again, for those who get symptoms, about 81% or so are mild to moderate, whereas about 20% are either severe or critical. The case fatality rate obviously varies, an average of around 2.3%, but for people who require mechanical ventilation, it's as high as 20%. The people who are at increased risk for severe COVID, we know well now through 20 months of clinical experience. And that is older adults, particularly the very elderly, over 75, 80, 85, and people of any age with certain underlying medical conditions. The severe manifestations are dominated by the acute respiratory distress syndrome, as well as now, as we get more experience, neurological, cardiac, acute kidney, hypercoagulation, and in advanced disease, a very unusual hyperinflammatory state whose treatment we'll talk about in a moment. And again, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children called MIS-C, which strikingly resembles Kawasaki syndrome. There's also post-COVID-19 conditions. Some are readily explainable, namely residual organ system dysfunction due to someone who originally had organ system damage. For example, if someone is on a ventilator, has a great deal of destruction of lung tissue, and then recovers, it is not surprising that they will have prolonged abnormalities of pulmonary function. But there are also those, anywhere from 10 to 30%, in which their signs and symptoms are not completely explainable by readily apparent or identifiable pathogenic processes. And we refer to that as long COVID. Very commonly reported signs and symptoms are extreme, sometimes debilitating fatigue, unexplained shortness of breath, muscle aches, dysautonomia, characterized by temperature dysregulation and unexplained tachycardia, sleep disturbances, depression, anxiety, and an interesting situation called brain fog, which actually means people cannot concentrate or focus. The medical management is varied. You can control symptoms without getting any kind of intervention in a hospital. Then you get end organ support, which requires hospitalization, be that oxygen, respiratory assistance, dialysis, and any other support of an individual organ. But then there's the pharmacological intervention, in which there's been advances now over the many months. The most important of which are shown on this slide. First, targeting the virus with the drug remdesivir, which is FDA approved. But as some of you may recall, last night or this morning, as it were, Merck made the announcement of the very striking results of keeping people out of the hospital who were treated early on in the course of disease of molnupiravir. There are other antivirals in clinical trials. Monoclonal antibodies shown very good results when given early, moderating host responses by anti-inflammatories such as dexamethasone, as well as monoclonal antibodies that block inflammatory processes such as tocilizumab and baricitinib. Again, adjunctive therapeutics. What we have launched very recently is a program to identify vulnerable targets on the replication cycle, to design drugs to inhibit these vulnerable targets, very similar to what we did so successfully, we being the scientific community, not just us here at NIH, but the entire scientific community and the pharmaceutical companies, of developing now combinations of drugs for HIV that have essentially transformed the lives of people living with HIV. The same holds true for hepatitis C. So here are some of the targets: protease, polymerase, entry inhibitors, again, very similar to HIV. Let's move on now to vaccines. It is no secret now that the overwhelming success of the entire effort to respond to this outbreak has been in the realm of the development of vaccines that are highly effective and safe. In fact, Science magazine deemed this the scientific breakthrough of the year of 2020. People always ask, how could it possibly have been done so quickly? 11 months from the sequence to a safe and effective vaccine? I tried to articulate this in a commentary I wrote a few months ago in Science magazine. And I said, as shown here, one of the quotes from that paper, the speed and efficiency with which these highly efficacious vaccines were developed and their potential for saving millions of lives are due to an extraordinary multidisciplinary effort involving basic preclinical and clinical science that had been underway out of the spotlight for decades before the unfolding of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so let me try and describe that by looking at it from the standpoint of the vaccine construct. First, the vaccine immunogen. This goes back to the structure-based vaccine design that we utilized in the as yet unsuccessful attempt to develop an HIV vaccine by getting the stabilized prefusion conformation of the envelope trimer of HIV, which much work using cryo-EM. We successfully made the immunogen. Unfortunately, we didn't have yet an HIV vaccine. However, researchers at the NIH Vaccine Research Center in my institute, led by Barney Graham, Jason McClellan, Kazmecki Corbett, Andrew Ward at Scripps, were very successful in making an RSV immunogen by getting the right mutations to stabilize the prefusion F protein of RSV, which is on the way, I'm virtually certain, of what will be a successful RSV vaccine. But that work of structure-based vaccine design was also utilized in an attempt to develop a MERS-CoV-2 spike antigen for a MERS vaccine, which is right now still in the process. The same investigators that I mentioned, as you see on this paper from PNAS. And so, as soon as that sequence hit the public database, that same team went to work and literally within days of the sequence, grabbed those mutations that stabilized the prefusion and highly immunogenic form of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, allowing for a highly successful immunogen that is being used not only in the mRNA of Moderna, but for virtually all of the other vaccines that are being used. Which brings us to the vaccine platform. Very many years of the evolution of the development of successful vaccine platforms. mRNA, viral vectors, recombinant proteins, nanoparticles, viral-like particles. The story of the mRNA is really interesting. Literally, now 16, 17 years ago, Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, a former fellow in my laboratory at NIH, showed that if you modify messenger RNA in a way that does not allow it to trigger key inflammatory pathways, makes it an ideal vector for a vaccine. Again, years ago, through investment in research with HIV, Dan Baruch at Harvard had been working with Ad26 in both Ebola and HIV. Again, one of the successful vectors or platforms, if I use that right terminology. So what do we have now? And I'm speaking only of vaccines in the United States. Russia, China, India, others have developed successful vaccines. The vaccines that we've dealt with have three separate platforms: mRNA, adeno, and recombinant protein. As you all know, the BioNTech Pfizer has received full FDA approval, BLA standing for Biological License Application. J&J and Moderna have gotten emergency use authorization, and others are also on the pathway for getting authorized. What have we seen now? I broke it up into three components. Efficacy in clinical trials. I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with this. These are the classic papers. For Pfizer, 95%, for Moderna, 94%. J&J, which was tested in multiple countries, had a 72% efficacy, but also a 64% efficacy in South Africa against the 351 or beta, now called beta variant. But one of the things that might have been surprising, but is actually extraordinarily welcome, is the effectiveness in the real world settings. I could give you paper after paper after paper, but in the United States, at least, the latest data now summarized here show that after Delta became the most common variant, a fully vaccinated person had a reduced risk of infection by 5-fold, hospitalization by about 11-fold, death by about 11-fold. If you look at other countries, such as the surveillance data from Israel, very impressive. All ages over 200 million person years, the real world effectiveness was well over 90%. Note, that's from January to April, not yet in the Delta era, and early on following vaccination, but all age groups seem to have been protected. So at least in the short run, the protection was extraordinary. Then along came the impact of both variants as well as durability of response. These are some of the variants we've had to deal with. As we all know, Delta dominates. The bully on the block that has essentially pushed all the other variants off. In the United States, we have close to 99% of all of the isolates are Delta variant. Why is that disconcerting? I believe the world knows that. Now over 160 countries have Delta variants detected. The problem is its transmissibility is at least 2 times greater than the Alpha variant, the B117 that we first had experience with. But importantly, the viral loads are up to 1,000 times greater, such that transmissibility is heightened even in people with breakthrough infections. It is likely now from data from at least other countries that it might even be more pathogenic. But then again, the issue of durability of response comes in. These are the data of effectiveness among multiple cohorts in the United States against infection. Very clear it goes down. If you look at effectiveness against hospitalization, although it seems to continue to hold steady, there's a hint and a strong hint as the weeks and months go by that too is waning. However, from our colleagues in Israel, who are about a month or so ahead of us in the vaccine rollout, are seeing now in people in a country which is essentially fully vaccinated, during the Delta wave, we are now seeing PCR positive infections increasing and severe COVID cases increasing over the few months of Delta. Hence the issue of a booster or a third shot for a 2-dose mRNA. In the Israeli case, it's Pfizer. First of all, what do boosters do? The data now show they dramatically increase the level of a neutralizing antibody, albeit that's not the only parameter of protection, but it is an important correlate. So look at the blue bars there. If you look at people 18 to 55 against the Delta variant, the titers go from 241 to 1321. For elderly, it goes from 123 to 1479. After the boost, the Israelis have demonstrated that the rate of confirmed infection was lower by a factor of 11, and the rate of severe illness lowered by a factor of almost 20 following a boost. This slide is so obvious and striking. What it is the looking at active severe COVID cases by vaccinated status in people 60 years of age or older. Unvaccinated, and this is per 100,000 population, 174 per 100,000 for unvaccinated, 33.7 for those with 2 doses of vaccine, and down to 3.4 for those with 2 doses of the vaccine plus the booster. The reactogenicity appears to be no greater than following the second dose. Very important. As many of you know, very recently, the United States looked at the data and made the determination from the authorization by the FDA and the recommendation from the ACIP that the recommendation now in the United States is that people who receive BioNTech completed their series at least 6 months ago, 65 years of age and older, 18 and older living in long-term care facilities, 18 and older with underlying medical conditions, and 18 and older who either work or live in a high-risk setting. Bringing up the question that is really literally moving in real time towards the answer. Is a booster shot a luxury? Is it a necessity for a waning vaccine regimen, or is and will a third shot booster be actually part of the original vaccine regimen? Now, anytime one speaks about boosters, you have to you really do have to, and we do take this very seriously, remember that we do have an obligation, and I believe a moral obligation, as rich countries to make sure that as we do that, we make doses available for the developing world. And the United States has done that, not as much as we can and will do, where we've already committed 1.1 billion doses to the developing world, $4 billion to the COVID, but we are working on ways to expand capacity so that at the same time we get the proper optimal regimen, that we also make sure the rest of the world, particularly low and middle income countries, are also have the equity of vaccine availability. So what it's all about, really, right now, as I speak to you, and as we go into the cooler months of the fall and the cold months of the winter and the flu season, it's going to be a race between vaccinations and SARS as a virus. Because in the United States, we have 70 million people who are eligible for vaccine who are not getting vaccinated. We absolutely have got to get the overwhelming proportion of that population vaccinated. And I'll close by a paper that I wrote with my colleagues, David Morins and Greg Folkers, now 13 years ago, that emerging infections, including what we are going through, is truly a perpetual challenge. History has shown us that. In order to meet the perpetual challenge, we must be perpetually prepared, which is the reason why I do hope that the lessons that we have learned and will learn from this outbreak does not escape our corporate memory as we emerge from the scourge of this outbreak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fauci, for your eye-opening lecture. I wanted to begin with some words that you used in your lecture. You said that we are living in history, or history to be made, that the numbers you outlined are stark. What can we take away from the fact that rich countries, as you say, like the US, with all the resources that it has at its disposal, can be as vulnerable as it has been in this pandemic?
Nala, that's a great question. And it tells us that you can prepare and think you are prepared. But when you get a virus that by its 100-year historic capabilities can break through any preparedness, however, the degree to which you are prepared can prevent it from becoming an emergence to an outbreak to a mild to moderate pandemic, a mild to moderate pandemic to a global historic pandemic. And what this has shown us is clearly, although we thought we were prepared, we were not prepared for this. And even countries who did well in the beginning, as they say, it came back to bite us all. We were comparing countries. Remember, oh, this country's doing pretty well, the other country's doing not so well. And at the end of the day, the virus proved to us that what we thought was good preparedness was not. We have got to have global transparency, global surveillance, rebuilding up of our public health infrastructure within each country. In the United States, we let our local public health infrastructure essentially experience attrition without rebuilding it. We should never, ever let that happen again. Thank goodness that the scientific approach that we had been preparing for a pandemic using a prototype pathogen, coronavirus, allowed us to be able to respond with a vaccine so quickly. And, in a somewhat paradoxical or diabolical way, the original SARS prepared us to be able to respond to this historic pandemic because of the investigators that I mentioned, Barney Graham and Kizzmekia Corbett. They would not have been working on getting a stabilized spike protein if we didn't have SARS and MERS. It would have taken much longer.
Dr. Fauci, part of the challenge to the scientific approach, as you described it, is the hesitancy or the skepticism around it. So I wanted to zoom out a little bit and ask you a little bit about that. In the 19th century in the West, science displaced religion as kind of the ultimate authority about the natural world. But now the authority of science in the public sphere is in danger of being displaced by, as you know, social media and political rhetoric. I'm wondering what you think happened. What happened?
Well, boy, Nala, if I only knew, this is something that is so disturbing to me as a physician, as a scientist, and as a public health person. I mean, if ever you could imagine the worst possible environment into which a global pandemic emerges would be in an environment of anti-science, complete normalization of lies, complete normalization of equating the true scientific data with complete nonsense and other. I mean, it is just mind-boggling. I mean, if I were some diabolical evil spirit and I wanted to cast upon the world, the worst time to get an outbreak is when you have the kind of combination divisiveness with the complete accessibility and spread of complete falsehood. I mean, there's nothing worse than that in the middle of a pandemic.
I'd like to break that down a little bit, but first I wanted to ask you whether there's any sense in which you might think that scientists themselves might have played any role, however unwitting, in undermining their own authority.
Oh, I guess in general, you're going to find a scientist or two who gets out there with data that, is not really well-founded, but because of the need to want to be known or something, could get something out there and say, oh, this works, that works, But when you come down to it, the serious scientists who are really concerned about evidence and data driving them, I think that they have performed really quite well. But there are people who are out there, it, I don't want to, if I become more specific, I will get maybe another 100,000 emails and get killed on Fox News or something, but it is the way it is, right?
A lot of the sentiment among those who are hesitant or who are, let's say, anti-vaxxers or anti-maskers is kind of this belief that individual freedom is being threatened by the state in imposing some of these mandates. Here in Canada, for example, we're seeing major outbreaks in a province like Alberta, where governments have been reluctant to infringe on individual choice by imposing public health restrictions. How would you approach, or how do you think we should approach the value of individual freedom within the context of this global pandemic?
Well, that is an extraordinarily relevant question, but a very difficult question because people interpret that in different ways. So let me just stay, for the record, so that, I'm smiling inside when I say this because I have this kind of proofreading mechanism. Like I know everything I say, some phrase is going to get taken out, and tonight it'll be on Fox News, tomorrow it'll be on Breitbart. It just depends. But in reality, since I'm never afraid of saying what the truth is, that I think the most important thing is to try and address people who have that attitude in trying to convince them of the importance of the safety for themselves, their family, and society. Number one, with the facts, and do it with a trusted messenger, not necessarily me or you, but someone who they feel they trust, be that a clergyman, be that a family member, a sports figure, someone who can relate to them in a non-confrontative way. Having said that, now I'm going to answer your question. I think what people have to appreciate that indeed you do have personal liberties for yourself and you should be in control of that. but you are a member of society. And as a member of society, reaping all the benefits of being a member of society, you have a responsibility to society. And I think each of us, particularly in the context of a pandemic that's killing millions of people, you have got to look at it and say, there comes a time when you do have to give up what you consider your individual right of making your own decision for the greater good of society. There's no doubt that that's the case. And, I think when people realize, well, it's my body. If I get infected, I don't really care because I'm a young person and and they're correct. That's the point. They're correct. It is likely if I'm a young, healthy person that I'm not going to have a serious outcome. But what sometimes gets blocked with blinders is that you could get infected, get no symptoms or mild symptoms, and inadvertently and innocently pass it on to someone else that will kill them. That will kill them. And I think we've really got to get people to understand that. There are so many examples that you can give, analogies of, I want to drive 95 miles an hour on the highway and it's my chance. If I get hurt, that's my problem. No, it's somebody who you might kill's problem also.
You've spent much of your career studying and fighting viruses, and the parallels with misinformation out there are striking. There's community spread, they come in successive waves, and in fact can lead to really deadly consequences. I'm wondering if there's anything we can learn from eradicating viruses that could help us in eradicating misinformation.
I really wish I had that answer for you. I don't understand what is going on in society. It worries me, quite frankly. It worries me deeply. I can say I lose as much sleep, to the extent that I get any sleep these days. I lose as much sleep worrying about the overall implications of the rampant spread of misinformation and disinformation on society in general, not just how you address an outbreak. I could make up something as an answer, but I don't have an answer. It's terrible how we've gotten into a situation, and I think it is the phenomenon of social media. Because some people might think some crazy thing, and if you're alone, say, well, I'm alone on this. And then all of a sudden they get on social media and all of a sudden they realize that there are a lot of other people that are fortifying, and social media has replaced the edited media where you have responsible people sorting out what's real and what's not and reporting it. Now, everything seems to be normalized. It's as easily to say something crazy as it is to say something that's based on years of scientific evidence. And then when you get in an argument, it's false equivalency. A Nobel laureate who discovered this says this, but Joe Jones on their Facebook said that. So, 1-to-1 equally could be correct. That has to be frightening because it's happening.
I have one last question, of course, many others to ask, but I do have that and one more from the McGill community. So just your thoughts on this. As you indicated, scientists do live kind of in this contradictory position. If you express uncertainty inherent in science, then you're told that you don't know what you're talking about. And yet we know from history that expressing absolute certainty in science can be catastrophic. How do we restore authority, a scientific authority in the public sphere?
I think that's science education, and that's a great question. And I think that's the reason why we have got to get back to getting STEM more emphasized in the education of our children, but also of the general public. One of the things that has been the source of considerable confusion is the lack of appreciation that science is evidence and data. And when you're dealing with an evolving situation in which what you know in January is different than what you learn in February, is different than what you learn in March and April and May, that scientists will look at the data as it exists in January and say, this is what we think is going on and this is what we recommend. Then when February and March come and you get new data, like asymptomatic spread, like aerosol spread, and you then change your recommendation, your perspective of what's going on, that is what science is. Science evolves and science corrects itself. There are many people who interpret that as flip-flopping. There they go again. They're flip-flopping. Why believe them? They told us this in January, and now they're telling us this here. That's the same theme that goes through criticisms of people, including me. You know, he said this in January, but now it's a year later, he's saying this. Well, guess what? Because the data and the science has changed. If a situation is static and you change your mind, you flip-flopped. But if the situation changes and you fail to change with the data, then you're really doing something wrong, not the opposite, namely continuing to go with the science. That has been completely, in many respects, lost by some people.
Final thing is, I have a question from a McGill graduate student whose name is Alyssa C. She's asking, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, where will we be with this pandemic?
Well, here's an answer that's based on reality. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because we have a highly effective tool that if we fully implemented it over the next year throughout the world by the end of 2022, we will not be in a pandemic phase. What we don't know is what will happen. If it becomes endemic, would it be a very low level that has essentially no impact on our lives, doesn't disrupt us and overturn us and turn us inside out the way it has now? We don't know the answer, but you know what my response is? Let's get out of the pandemic first. And right now we're still in a pandemic phase and we have the tools to get out of it, a highly effective set of vaccines. Once we do that, then we can really start figuring out how we're going to be able to keep it suppressed.
Dr. Fauci, you are 80 now. And I wonder if you could just take a moment and imagine 100 years from now, students looking back at history and looking back at your career. I wonder what it is that you hope that your legacy will be.
Well, I've devoted my life to public service, and by a set of circumstances beyond my control, I happen to have been involved in the middle of some of the worst outbreaks of infectious diseases in history. And I would hope I will be remembered by someone who tried their best and had an impact.
Dr. Fauci, thank you very, very much for answering our questions.
Thank you for having me.
Very good to talk to you. And that is the end of our discussion. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of those. And again, thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your very engaging presentation. It's been a pleasure to be here with you, all of you. And now I invite you, our audience, joining us from all around the world, to stay tuned to this broadcast, because in a few minutes, McGill University will confer the degree of Doctor of Science honoris causa on Dr. Fauci in a very special ceremony. I also invite you to stay tuned to learn more about a newly published anthology of Beatty lectures from McGill Queen University Press. It's now my pleasure to introduce Luciano Diorio, President of the McGill Alumni Association, to share some remarks.
Merci, Nala. I am Luciano Diorio, President of the McGill Alumni Association. I wish to express our gratitude to you, Dr. Fauci, for taking the time to share your insights with us this afternoon. Dr. Fauci, your remarkable career and your steadfast commitment to the well-being of the global community has been an inspiration to McGill's global alumni network of 275,000 people in more than 180 countries around the world. We thank you. We also wish to express our thanks to Nala Ayed for hosting today's lecture. Thank you as well, Nala, for your dedication to the highest standards of journalism in Canada. To everyone watching from here in Montreal and from around the world, thank you for joining us, and I wish you a great rest of the day.
The triumph of the communist revolution in China in 1940.
In the world of reality, apartheid as a system of control with almost unlimited amounts of power at the disposal of ministers and administrators.
I believe the young people of the world have much in common. For one thing, we all share the effects.
It's clear that we have another revolution well underway, but really only in its early stages, begun in the last 20 years or so.
We should be able to move through this world freely, safe and strong in our bodies. We should be able to thrive unfettered by the chronic malignancy that is misogyny.
Each year, McGill University brings a distinguished visitor to deliver the series of talks known as the Beatty Lectures, which were established as a memorial to Sir Edward Beatty.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, for delivering the 2021 virtual Beatty Lecture as part of our fall homecoming festivities. We are delighted to have you with us. I know that I speak on behalf of everyone watching when I say that we all enjoyed your stimulating lecture. It's a privilege also to have you with us for this special honorary degree ceremony. McGill University's honorary degrees are the means by which the university expresses its highest ideals, recognizing individuals whose accomplishments are of such excellence that they provide inspiration and leadership to the community. A world-renowned scientist, Dr. Anthony Fauci, is a pioneer in the research of pathogenesis and the treatment of immune-mediated and infectious diseases. He has served as the chief medical advisor to 7 US presidents. After obtaining his medical degree from Cornell University in 1966, Dr. Fauci joined the National Institute of Health in 1968 as a clinical associate in the Laboratory of Clinical Investigation at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In 1974, he became the head of the Clinical Physiology section and was appointed the chief of the Laboratory of Immunoregulation in 1980, a position he still holds today. In 1984, Dr. Fauci was appointed Director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, overseeing an extensive portfolio of research to prevent, diagnose, and treat established infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and respiratory infections, as well as emerging diseases like Zika and Ebola. As the chief of the Laboratory of Immunoregulation, Dr. Fauci has made prolific contributions to the field of human immunoregulation, making vital scientific observations that underpin the current understanding of the regulation of the human immune response. Additionally, Dr. Fauci is widely credited for delineating the precise ways in which immunosuppressive agents modulate the human immune response. He's responsible for developing effective therapies for several formerly fatal immunomediated and inflammatory diseases. Furthermore, Dr. Fauci has made pivotal contributions to the understanding of how HIV destroys the body's defenses, leading to its susceptibility to deadly infections, as well as developing treatments that enable those with HIV to enjoy long and active lives. He was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that has saved millions of lives throughout the developing world. More recently, Dr. Fauci's tireless work to combat the COVID-19 pandemic has helped shape the US federal government's response while leading the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases sponsored research to better understand, prevent, and treat COVID-19. Dr. Fauci continues to provide critical public health guidance based on the best available science and evidence through numerous compelling media appearances. Among his many prestigious awards and distinctions, Dr. Fauci is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2008, the highest honor given to a civilian by the President of the United States, as well as the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic in 2020, the highest ranking honor of the Republic. He is also the recipient of the National Medal of Science, 2005, the George M. Kober Medal of the Association of American Physicians in 2007, the Mary Woodward Lasker Award for Public Service in 2007, and the Robert Koch Gold Medal in 2013. Dr. Fauci is a member of several academies, including the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Science. Mr. Chancellor, it is my great pleasure to present to you Dr. Anthony Fauci so that you may confer upon him the degree of Doctor of Science honoris causa.
McGill's highest honor, an honorary degree, is awarded to individuals who have lifetime records of outstanding scholarly scientific or artistic achievement, or of exceptional contributions to the public good through professional or philanthropic activity that makes them worthy candidates and positions them to contribute to McGill's reputation and distinction, both at home and internationally. It is my immense pleasure, in my capacity as Chancellor of McGill University, to award an honorary degree to an individual who embodies many of these traits and is extremely worthy of this honor, Dr. Anthony S. Fauci. By virtue of the powers conferred on me by Senate, I declare that the University Senate has resolved that the degree of Doctor of Science, honoris causa, be bestowed on Dr. Anthony Fauci on October 1st, 2021. En vertu des pouvoirs qui me sont conférés par le Sénat, je déclare que le Sénat de l'Université a résolu que le diplôme honorifique de Docteur S. Sciences honoris causa est décerné au Monsieur Anthony Fauci le 1er octobre 2021.
Thank you so much for bestowing upon me this wonderful honor. I am both humbled and highly appreciative to receive this recognition from your renowned and prestigious institution, for which I have great respect. This is particularly meaningful to me as I have a kinship with McGill. I have had for more than 5 decades and continue to have significant collaborations and shared experiences with McGill scientists and McGill graduates, including investigators in my own laboratory. As has been the case for virtually everyone in your country and mine and around the world, this has been an extraordinary, challenging 19 months. I have had the opportunity and privilege to be part of the public health and scientific response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This global health crisis has changed the landscape of all our lives, and this continues to be a challenging time for all of us. Such times call upon us to work together. One of the important things that I have come to appreciate in my experiences this year is how destructive divisiveness is. I have seen this play out in my own country. If there are any lessons that we have learned from this pandemic, they are that 1, science will provide the solution to this pandemic, as we have seen with the rapid and successful development of multiple safe and highly effective vaccines. And 2, societal divisiveness is counterproductive in a pandemic. We must not be at odds with each other, since the virus is the enemy, not each other. Hopefully, as we move forward, our collective commitment, tireless efforts, passion, and resilience will help us achieve a successful end to this unprecedented public health emergency. Only by working together with our partners in academia, industry, and the community will we be able to rapidly achieve this goal and be prepared to respond to future infectious diseases outbreaks that inevitably will occur. Once again, thank you so much for this great honor.